I think this all makes a lot of sense. I'd like to focus on the corporate governance, on changing the culture in particular. Obviously, several deputies and senators have talked about the groupthink and the dangers there. One thing I would like your thoughts on is one thing that is absent from the strategy in terms of stakeholder engagement is Oireachtas engagement. As you know, and are probably becoming uncomfortably familiar with, the way we tend to engage with the departments is through PQs. I'm new to politics myself, and it's an extraordinarily inefficient way of trying to get things done. I imagine your officials find it quite frustrating. It can feel very frustrating on this side as well. So I'd just like to start by asking you, have you given any thought to how the department and the Oireachtas, because both sides definitely are involved here, can begin to work more constructively together?
I hesitate to say it, but I think I probably will, that PQs I don't think are either a very efficient way to do things, do business, and indeed it is perhaps something that has shocked me since coming to the department, is the amount of time of officials that is actually consumed by the process, particularly because we're very often touching on some of the same issues, and in terms of them. I think that forums like this, for example, can be very helpful if there is actually a sort of a discussion of, for example, how we work, soliciting ideas. I think I mentioned that we have a renewed focus in the department about how we use the audit committee and how it should actually be to help us to advise. I think committees like this can actually also help us to understand how we should look at things and how we should operate our business. So,
thank you. On a slide aside, I don't know if it's possible, but in terms of the budget prep, there is a piece of information which my understanding is gets released just the weekend of the budget announcement, which is the 2013 no policy change scenario, which really any budget preparation or budget submission requires. And maybe it's a government decision rather than a department decision, but if at all possible, I'd love you to take a look at being able to get that no policy change. In other words, what would happen if we continued on as is for next year? Because obviously when you're trying to figure out the deltas and you're trying to figure out the ratios, the 3.5 billion and so forth, really you need a no policy change scenario. So if it was at all possible to accelerate that, it would be incredibly useful. On the personal insolvency bill, it's something I'm spending a lot of time on at the moment. In order for it to work, it's going to require a massive change in position of the banks. We had Richie Boucher in here last week, and his performance, to my mind, was outrageous. It was absolutely outrageous. I lived and worked in the UK for a number of years, and my view is that if he treated a UK House of Commons Select Committee, if the Chief Executive of the UK Bank treated a Select Committee in the way he treated this committee, there would be widespread calls for their resignation. Now, he refused to answer my question as to whether or not Bank of Ireland had engaged in any debt surrender with unsustainable mortgages, even though he answered the question before. He also refused to say whether or not Bank of Ireland would even consider the possibility of debt surrender as part of personal insolvency legislation. Now, are you satisfied that, and Mr Masding, Chief Executive Permanent TSB, essentially said the same thing. AIB, we know, has done very, very little. So we've seen a very consistent and robust position from the banks which says we will surrender nothing unless absolutely forced to. The personal insolvency legislation doesn't force them to. It definitely makes the negotiation more interesting. I've got there.
Okay.
Are you satisfied, Mr Moran, that the banks are going to significantly change their approach to date in terms
Thank you,
of
Deputy Donnelly. Mr Moran.
Okay. I think in a somewhat under-publicised speech I made about sort of 3 weeks ago on the banking sector, I made my views known about where the banks need to go in terms of this. And in fact, in perhaps a sort of a part of that speech that wasn't actually fully sort of reported was to point out just how important moving forward on this is for the economy to actually recover and Ergo, just how important the recovery of the economy is for the bank's profitability. I think there is an issue to actually try and look at what, in fact, is happening to debt that is unsustainable in a personal situation and moving forward on that. And I think Richie and others do know our views on it very clearly.
Thank you. Final question, Chair. Have I time for one more?
Just quickly.
Thanks. One thing I haven't seen in the presentation in your statement is NAMA. Can you explain what level of oversight the department has for NAMA and what resources you have against that oversight?
Okay. One of the changes, actually, it probably isn't in the statement of strategy specifically, that when we took a look at the restructuring of the department in terms of the way we were doing it, previously we had been treating NAMA differently than the banks in which we hold shareholdings. And indeed, in effect, the life companies that we'd been holding were falling in two stools. So we have now moved the oversight of NAMA and our involvement in the protection, effectively, of the state's interest with respect to the assets that NAMA holds into the shareholder management unit. So it's part of an exercise to consolidate, because I didn't see the difference between, in many ways, the economic interests that the state owns, whether it owns them through a shareholding in the banks or indeed through an exposure to the ultimate responsibility or recovery of NAMA and assets.